13 soldiers are dead, gas prices are at a $4 high, and a $200 billion funding request is on the table. But yesterday, Friday, the House narrowly voted to keep the undeclared war in Iran moving forward.
It was a tight squeeze, Paige. 218 votes to 211. That's the razor-thin margin keeping Operation Epic Fury funded, while the Department of Homeland Security remains essentially dark. We're on day 42 of the shutdown, and yet the money for overseas kinetic action seems to be the only thing the gears of the House can actually turn for right now. It is almost like the government is trying to drive a car with a seized engine, while still somehow finding the cash to upgrade the stereo.
The transcript from the floor captures this really specific duality. You have members like the Republican from Texas, Representative Chip Roy, arguing that the border remains a primary theater of concern. Yet the legislative priority on Friday was clearly the supplemental for the Middle East. It is a sharp shift from what we saw earlier in the week, where the SAVE Act was the dominant topic of conversation.
And it's not just about the money. It's about the authority. A record shows a real pushback on the lack of a formal declaration of war. Yet the votes keep landing in favor of the status quo. The debate over Amendment 412, which would have capped that spending, shows it was rejected almost entirely along party lines, but with a few notable defections. Is the war of choice narrative we've been tracking finally starting to bleed into the mainstream? The transcript suggests the answer is shifting.
We have some room to really dig into those defections today, along with the latest on the FAA's struggle to keep planes in the air, as the DHS funding gap hits the 6-week mark.
Right. It's a heavy Friday record to unpack, and we can take a moment to look at the fine print, because there's a lot underneath the surface of that $200 billion figure.
Let's start with the cost that isn't just measured in dollars. First up, the price of Operation Epic Fury. Yesterday, Friday, in the House, Representative Mike Rogers, a Republican from Alabama, stood to speak about a name that has been resonating deeply across his home state since the middle of the month. It was a tribute to Major John Alex Klinner, who was killed on March 12, 2026. He wasn't just a name on a casualty list. He was a husband, a father of 3, and a central figure in the Birmingham and Auburn communities. Since we have a moment to really look at the people behind these massive military operations, it's worth stalking on Major Klinner, because his story is, in many ways, the story of how Operation Epic Fury is actually being sustained on the ground and in the air.
It's a story that highlights a part of the military that often gets overlooked in the headlines. We hear about the fighter jets and the precision strikes on Iranian naval assets, but none of that happens without the tankers. Major Klinner was a member of the 99th Air Refueling Squadron, based out of Birmingham. He was flying a KC-135 Stratotanker when it went down in western Iraq. For those who aren't familiar with the airframe, the KC-135 is essentially a flying gas station. It's a massive, 4-engine jet that's been the backbone of American aerial refueling for decades. It is the reason the United States can maintain what Central Command calls near-total air superiority in a conflict like this. You can't keep those 7,000 strikes going if your planes have to land every 2 hours to fuel up.
And the record shows that Major Klinner was exceptionally experienced in that specific, high-stakes environment. Representative Rogers noted that he had logged 543 combat and combat support flight hours. If you look at the timeline, Klinner joined the Air Force in 2017 through the ROTC program after graduating from Auburn University. To hit over 500 combat hours in less than a decade, especially with the high-tempo operations we've seen recently, says a lot about the pace he was keeping. He had actually just been promoted to major right before this deployment.
That promotion speaks to the leadership side of things that Rogers emphasized. He mentioned that Klinner was a mechanical engineer by trade. He got that degree from Auburn in 2016. There's a specific kind of mind that goes into both engineering and piloting a tanker. It's about precision, weight distribution, and managing complex systems under pressure. But Rogers didn't just talk about his technical skills. He brought up Alex's time as a counselor at Camp Mack in Munford, Alabama. It's a small detail, but it paints a picture of someone who was a devoted servant leader long before he ever put on a flight suit.
That servant leader phrase came up several times in the tribute. Rogers really wanted the House to understand that this was a person who was deeply embedded in his community. He grew up in Auburn, went to Auburn High School, then the university. He was one of those people who stayed connected to his roots, even as his career took him across the globe. When we talk about the human cost of a campaign like Epic Fury, we're talking about the void left in places like Birmingham and Auburn. Major Klinner is survived by his wife, Libby, and their 3 young children. That is a heavy reality to sit with, while the policy debate about the war continues to swirl.
It also brings up a question about the nature of the risks in western Iraq right now. Central Command has been reporting that Iranian aerial threats are plummeting and that American forces have effectively neutralized most of the high-end air defenses. Yet on March 12th, we lost a KC-135 and 6 airmen. 3 of them, including Klinner, were from that 99th Air Refueling Squadron. It's a reminder that even when you have air superiority, the operational tempo itself, the sheer number of sorties being flown to maintain that 7,000 target pressure, creates its own set of dangers. Fatigue, mechanical stress on aging airframes, and the sheer complexity of refueling missions in a combat zone are always there, regardless of whether there's an enemy missile in the air.
The transcript of the tribute really hammers home the solemnity of the moment. Representative Rogers concluded his remarks with a direct call to the House. He said, and I'm quoting the record here, "Mr. Speaker, please join me in honoring the life and service of Major John Alex Klinner and extending our deepest condolences to his family. We remain grateful for his service." It's one of those moments where the political noise of the Capitol just drops away for a minute. You have the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee standing there, not talking about budgets or procurement or the 40-day shutdown, but about a father of 3 from his district who didn't come home.
It's interesting you mentioned the shutdown context, because these 2 things are happening in parallel. While the House is processing these tributes, and the military is conducting these high-intensity strikes, the administrative and financial side of the government is essentially in a state of paralysis. There's a tension there that's hard to ignore. You have service members like Major Klinner performing at the highest possible level under the most extreme conditions, while back in D.C., the Department of Homeland Security is effectively dark. It creates this jarring disconnect between the front lines and the legislative gears.
That disconnect is something we've seen throughout the Congressional Record this week. There's this constant movement between the life and death reality of Epic Fury and the procedural gridlock of the funding battle. In Major Klinner's case, his service spanned the transition between administrations and the launch of this massive new campaign in late February. He was a veteran of the system who was caught in its most recent, most intense gear. Rogers made sure to list his parents, Johnny and Mary Ellen, and his sisters, making it clear that this loss radiates through an entire extended family in Alabama.
And the 6th Air Refueling Wing, which the 99th is a part of, has been taking a lot of the weight for these missions. When you look at the logistics, Western Iraq is a critical corridor for refueling assets because it sits right between the major bases and the target zones in Iran. The tankers have to be there. They have to be orbiting in these tow line patterns for hours, waiting for the strike packages to come to them. It's grueling work. Rogers' tribute is a rare moment where the record pulls back the curtain on the people who are actually keeping those planes in the air, 543 combat hours at a time.
It's a perspective that puts the day 28 or day 30 count of the operation into a different light. For the policy analysts, it's a duration. For the Klinner family, March 12th is the only date that matters now. Rogers' speech was a brief moment of unity, but it also underscores the mounting pressure on Congress to figure out what the long-term plan is. How long can this tempo be maintained before the human and mechanical costs become the lead story instead of the target counts?
Exactly. You can only sustain Epic Fury if the domestic foundation is solid. And right now, that foundation is looking pretty shaky. While the House honors the sacrifice of airmen in Iraq, they're also staring down a total collapse of the DHS budget and a security apparatus that's running on fumes.
That contrast brings us directly to the other side of the ledger. While the military is operating at full throttle abroad, the agencies responsible for the home front are hitting a wall. We are now entering the 6th week of the DHS funding standoff, and the rhetoric on the floor yesterday, Friday, suggests that the light at the end of the tunnel isn't just dim, it might be out entirely.
Yeah, we're moving from the high-altitude reality of the Air Force to the ground-level chaos of a department that has been in the dark for over 40 days. This isn't just about paychecks anymore. It's about the basic ability of the government to keep its own doors open while it tries to manage a war and a border at the same time.
The technicalities are exactly where this gets interesting, Reed. While the House was grappling with the domestic fallout of the shutdown on Friday, they also spent a significant amount of time on H.R. 7084. That is, the Defending American Property Abroad Act of 2026. On the surface, it sounds like a very standard, broad piece of foreign policy legislation. But the debate on the floor yesterday made it clear, this is a very specific, very pointed response to a single corporate dispute in Mexico.
And it is a dispute that has been simmering for years. We are talking about the Vulcan Materials Company, which is based in Alabama. Back in the late 80s, they built this massive deepwater port and a limestone quarry in the Yucatan Peninsula. It's the only deepwater port in that specific region. And for decades, it was a major hub for shipping construction materials into the United States. But starting around 2022, the relationship between the company and the Mexican government didn't just sour, it essentially evaporated into a series of military occupations and legal maneuvers.
The record from Friday details a sequence of events that sounds more like a geopolitical thriller than a trade dispute. According to the floor statements, the Mexican government sent in the military to shut down the operations. Then, in 2024, they designated the port and the quarry as a naturally protected area. Supporters of the bill, like Representative August Pfluger, a Republican from Texas, argued that this environmental label was used as a pretext to complete a state-sanctioned seizure of private property.
What stands out in the transcript is the language being used to describe this. We usually hear very sanitized, diplomatic phrasing when members of Congress talk about a major trading partner like Mexico. But yesterday, the gloves were off. Representative Mike Ezel, a Republican from Mississippi and a former sheriff, really set the tone for the proponents. He said, "Where I come from, when you take something that doesn't belong to you, that is stealing, and you have broken the law. If you break the law, there are consequences."
That stealing narrative was a recurring theme throughout the hour of debate. The Alabama delegation was out in full force because Vulcan is headquartered in Birmingham. Representative Gary Palmer, a Republican from Alabama, went as far as to compare the Mexican government's actions to those of a cartel. He argued that if the United States doesn't respond to the seizure of a deepwater port, it sends a signal to every other American business operating abroad that their assets are essentially up for grabs whenever a local government changes its mind.
The bill itself is a fascinating mechanism. It doesn't just issue a strongly worded letter. It targets the maritime logistics of the seized property. It gives the president the authority to identify any port or terminal in the Western Hemisphere that has been nationalized or expropriated from a U.S. person without compensation. Once a port is designated, the president can essentially ban any vessel that has transited through that port from entering United States waters.
It's a secondary sanction, essentially. It tells global shipping companies, you can use that seized port in Mexico if you want, but if you do, your ships are no longer welcome in Los Angeles, Mobile, or Savannah. Representative Pfluger called it surgical, arguing it wouldn't disrupt legitimate trade because it only applies to facilities that were specifically stolen. But that is exactly where the opposition, led by Representative Rick Larsen, a Democrat from Washington, began to push back.
Larson's argument was less about the merits of the property dispute and more about the practical reality of enforcement. He pointed out that this bill effectively turns the United States Coast Guard into a global property rights referee. The Coast Guard is the agency that would have to track these vessels, identify their transit history, and enforce the ban at the maritime border.
And he brought some pretty striking numbers to the floor to explain why that's a problem. Larson noted that the vice commandant of the Coast Guard recently testified that the service is a $20 billion organization trying to survive on a $13 billion budget. He argued that asking a strained, underfunded service to police international corporate real estate disputes is a recipe for operational failure, especially when they are already breaking records for drug interdictions and search and rescue missions.
This is where the debate gets into the "here's what most people don't realize" territory. If you look at the USMCA, the trade agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada, there are already massive established systems for resolving these exact types of conflicts. There is an arbitration process. There are tribunals. Representative Chuy Garcia, a Democrat from Illinois, argued that Congress is essentially jumping the gun. He pointed out that the Vulcan dispute is currently going through international arbitration, and by passing this bill, the House is attempting to bypass the very treaty the U.S. signed just a few years ago.
Garcia also raised the point that the local communities in Mexico have their own perspective here. He mentioned that some of these communities have raised concerns about environmental damage and water safety related to the limestone mining. His argument was that by using the full force of the U.S. government to protect a corporation, Congress might be steamrolling the legitimate environmental sovereignty of a neighbor. It's a classic tension between international property rights and local environmental protections.
But that argument didn't seem to gain much traction with the proponents. Representative Terry Sewell, a Democrat from Alabama, actually crossed the aisle to support the bill. She spoke quite personally about having met with the former Mexican president, López Obrador, to discuss this. She told the House that she was essentially told a solution would require an act of Congress. So, from her perspective, the diplomatic route hasn't just been slow, it has been a dead end.
She had a very direct quote on the floor. She said, "I was told by the president that we had to have an act of Congress in order for the port to be returned. So, today I say proudly, we are doing something." That's a powerful moment of bipartisan alignment. You had Representative Sewell and Representative Robert Aderholt, a Republican from Alabama, using almost identical language to defend a company in their home state.
It's rare to see that level of regional unity across party lines lately. But we should talk about the detour Representative Larson took during his closing remarks. In the middle of this heated debate over international trade and seizures, he shifted gears to talk about the chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Representative Sam Graves, a Republican from Missouri. It turns out that Friday morning, Chairman Graves announced he won't be seeking re-election.
That was a real stop-and-look moment in the record. Larson called the committee an island of partnership in a sea of partisanship, and credited Graves for that. Even while they were disagreeing on the Vulcan bill, the rapport was visible. It's a reminder that even as these huge fights over shutdowns and international sanctions are happening, there are these long-standing personal working relationships that keep the committees functioning.
It's a bit of a bittersweet note, though, isn't it? Larson mentioned that Graves loves three things: his grandkids, vintage aircraft, and Congress, in that order. But seeing a chairman like that depart right as these major infrastructure and trade fights are peaking, it adds another layer of uncertainty to how the House handles these issues moving forward. If the island of partnership loses its architect, does the committee become as fractured as the rest of the floor?
The vote on H.R. 7084 itself reflected some of that lingering partnership, though. It passed 247 to 164. That means 41 Democrats joined the Republican majority to pass it. That is a significant margin for a bill that Representative Larson, the ranking Democrat on the committee, was actively opposing. It suggests that the property rights argument carries a lot of weight across the board when a specific American company is being targeted.
Wait, let's look at the breakdown there. If 41 Democrats crossed over, that means the opposition wasn't a monolith. You had members like Representative Salud Carbajal, a Democrat from California, who actually co-sponsored the bill. He argued that trade should be a race to the top and that respecting the rights of investors is part of that. He basically dismissed the Mexican government's environmental claims, pointing out that Vulcan had actually received several clean industry awards from Mexico's own environmental agency in the past.
Carvajal's point was that you can't give a company awards for environmental stewardship one year and then use environmental harm as a reason to seize their multi-million-dollar port the next. He called it speaking out of both sides of your mouth. It's that kind of detail in the record that makes this feel less like a broad policy debate and more like a targeted retaliatory strike. The House is essentially telling the Mexican government, we see the inconsistency, and we are going to make it expensive for you.
The question now is what the Senate does with it. With the USMCA review coming up soon, this bill is a massive bargaining chip. It gives the U.S. executive branch a very sharp tool that they didn't have before. But it also risks a retaliatory trade war. If Mexico decides to respond to these port restrictions with their own measures against U.S. goods, the surgical nature of this bill could quickly become a much broader economic headache.
And the irony of the timing shouldn't be lost on anyone. At the same moment the House is voting to authorize the president to ban international shipping vessels to protect an Alabama limestone company, they still haven't cleared the path to ensure the people who would enforce that ban, the Coast Guard, are actually going to get a paycheck next week. The record shows this constant cognitive dissonance. One minute, the House is the protector of global American interests. The next, it's a body that can't quite figure out how to keep its own lights on.
That dissonance is the defining feature of this session. We see it in the foreign policy bills, we see it in the committee retirements, and we see it in the debate over domestic priorities. Speaking of domestic priorities, while the House was focused on deep-water ports in the Yucatan, there was another quietly growing crisis being entered into the record. It's a different kind of infrastructure problem, not one made of limestone and concrete, but one made of people.
You're talking about the healthcare workforce. If you look at the extensions of remarks from Friday, several members are sounding the alarm on a very specific number, 124,000. That is the projected physician gap in this country over the next decade. And just like the Vulcan Standoff, the proposed solutions involve a tangle of federal funding, immigration policy, and some very frustrated members of Congress.
It is a staggering figure when you break it down into actual human impact. 124,000 physicians missing from the system by 2034 isn't an abstract statistical dip. If you look at the current physician workforce, we're talking about losing a number of doctors equivalent to the entire medical staff of several mid-sized states combined. Representative Susie Lee, a Democrat from Nevada, entered a statement into the record yesterday, Friday, that really hits on why this isn't a problem we can solve by just opening more medical schools in big cities. She pointed out that for states like Nevada, the shortage is already manifesting as a crisis of distance and time. When you have a gap this large, the first places to lose coverage are the ones that are already on the edge, the rural communities and underserved urban pockets.
The statement Lee submitted was part of National AHEC Week, which ran from March 23rd through March 27th. For those who don't spend their time digging through the Health Resources and Services Administration budget, AHEC stands for Area Health Education Centers. These centers are essentially the bridge between medical education and the communities that need it most. Lee was very specific in the record about the consequences of neglecting this bridge. She said, and I'm quoting here, Southern Nevadans are facing a dire shortage of healthcare providers, which means longer wait times, fewer choices, and less access to quality care. It's a very grounded way of describing a massive systemic failure. If you live in Elko or even parts of Las Vegas, the physician gap isn't a white paper topic. It's the reality of waiting 6 months for a specialist appointment.
And the AHEC model she's defending is interesting because it addresses the leaky bucket problem in medical training. We know from years of data that medical students tend to practice within a relatively small radius of where they complete their residency or clinical rotations. If every residency slot is in Boston or San Francisco, those doctors stay in Boston or San Francisco. The AHEC program tries to pivot that by placing training resources in places like Elko and Reno. Lee noted that these centers have already trained millions of professionals, but there is a huge financial headwind here. The American Hospital Association estimates that we need 200,000 new registered nurses every single year just to keep pace with the number of people retiring from the profession. We are trying to fill a reservoir while the dam is actively crumbling.
Lee has been carving out a very specific niche on this issue within the House Appropriations Committee. She's not just talking about the theoretical need for more doctors. She's been actively funneling federal dollars into these specific pipelines. The record shows she recently secured nearly $12 million for school mental health providers. That's a key detail because the workforce shortage isn't limited to surgeons or GPs. It's the entire ecosystem of care. In her remarks yesterday, she mentioned that the Nevada AHEC program is strengthening the future of our healthcare workforce, which will help the health of all Nevadans. It's a push for what she calls essential federal investments. But this advocacy is happening against the backdrop of a very ticking clock regarding the Affordable Care Act subsidies.
That's where the policy tension gets really thick. Lee has been warning that if the current ACA subsidies are allowed to expire, around 80,000 Nevadans could lose their health insurance or find it completely unaffordable. This creates a bizarre policy paradox in the record. On one hand, you have members of Congress like Lee fighting to build a workforce to treat people, and on the other hand, the funding for the people to actually buy that care is on the chopping block. You can build the most efficient AHEC training center in the world in rural Nevada. But if the patients there lose their subsidies and can't afford the visit, the doctor you just trained doesn't have a viable practice to run. It's two different fiscal fights happening in the same room.
Exactly. And the timing of her statement is a strategic choice. The fiscal year 2026 appropriations process is ramping up, and community project requests are due by April 11th. By entering this into the record now, she's signaling to the committee leadership that healthcare workforce development is her top-tier priority for this funding cycle. She's previously worked on the Train More Nurses Act and the Support Reauthorization Act, which specifically targets youth substance abuse. She is building a legislative paper trail that says we cannot wait for the 124,000 physician shortage to actually arrive in 2034. If we wait for the shortage to hit its peak, the infrastructure to train their replacements will have already withered. It's about preventing a total staffing collapse that is still a decade away.
It's also a rare area where you see some actual bipartisan movement, even if it's quiet. The Train More Nurses Act had support across the aisle because every single district, regardless of whether it's deep red or deep blue, is feeling the retirement wave of the baby boomer generation. When you look at the floor activity from Friday, you see this recurring theme of members trying to shore up their local institutions before the next census or the next major budget showdown. Lee's focus on Nevada is a microcosm of a national anxiety. She mentioned that AHECs are part of that solution, but the scale of the problem she's describing suggests they are currently more of a finger in the dike than a permanent fix.
There's a sense of urgency in her language that the record doesn't always capture in these commemorative week speeches. Usually, National AHEC Week would be a brief, pleasant nod to a local program, but Lee's remarks read more like a warning shot. She's linking the local success of programs in Elko and Reno to a national survival strategy for the healthcare system. The math simply doesn't work if the federal government pulls back on these training subsidies now. If the 2034 projections hold true, the wait time she's worried about in southern Nevada today will look like the good old days compared to a decade from now. It's a battle over who gets to stay in their community and who has to drive 3 hours to see a doctor.
And that struggle for care, that tension between the promise of a service and the reality of the bureaucracy, isn't just limited to the civilian world. While Representative Lee is looking at the future of rural clinics, another group of people is currently navigating a very different kind of healthcare maze. This one is within the Department of Veterans Affairs, and it involves a specific procedural hurdle that is trapping people between their service records and the medical benefits they were promised. It's a phenomenon some on the Hill are starting to call the combat injury trap. And the details coming out of the Veterans Affairs Committee this week suggest the fix might be even more complicated than training 100,000 new doctors. The situation you're describing with rural healthcare wait times is mirrored in a very specific, much quieter struggle within the veteran community. It's what policy wonks call concurrent receipt. But for the people living through it, it feels like a combat injury tax. It's a mechanical quirk in how the federal government calculates retirement versus disability pay. And it's surfaced again in the record from yesterday, Friday, March 27th.
Representative Gabe Vasquez, a Democrat from New Mexico, entered a statement into the record to recognize a man named Pete Benavides. Pete is a veteran from Belen, New Mexico, who served more than 20 years across the Army and the New Mexico National Guard. His story is the textbook example of why this policy is so contentious on the Hill right now.
The specifics of Benavides' service are intense. He was a track vehicle repairer. During a recovery operation for a vehicle in a combat zone, he was hit by an improvised explosive device. The explosion caused severe brain damage. That injury eventually led to a medical discharge, which is the pivot point for this entire legislative debate.
Exactly. Because he was medically retired due to combat injuries before hitting certain longevity milestones, he falls into a gap in the law. Under current rules, many veterans who are forced to retire due to combat injuries have their military retirement pay reduced dollar for dollar by the amount of disability compensation they receive from the VA. They are essentially forced to choose one or the other, or rather, the government chooses for them by offsetting the payments.
It's a legacy of 19th century law that viewed receiving both as double dipping. The logic was that you shouldn't get two checks from the same treasury for the same period of service. But the counter-argument, which Pete Benavides has been making to the New Mexico delegation, is that retirement pay is a benefit earned for service, while disability pay is compensation for an injury. They serve two completely different purposes.
Vasquez was very pointed about Pete's role in this. He noted that Pete couldn't maintain traditional employment because of those brain injuries sustained in the IED blast. Instead, he spent his time as a volunteer advocate. I'll read the quote directly from the record. During my time in Congress, he has worked closely with my office to advocate for the Major Richard Starr Act and other measures to improve veterans' lives.
That mention of the Major Richard Starr Act is the key. That bill has been floating around for a few sessions now. It's named after a combat engineer who was medically retired and became a face for this movement. The bill would allow Chapter 61 retirees, those with combat-related disabilities and fewer than 20 years of service, to receive both their retirement and disability pay in full.
It's interesting to look at the support list for that act. It usually has massive bipartisan co-sponsorship. We're talking over 300 members of the House. On paper, it's a slam dunk. But the detour we have to take here is into the Congressional Budget Office, or the CBO. They've estimated the cost of fixing this offset at somewhere around $10 billion over a decade. In a climate where every dollar is being scrutinized by the new fiscal oversight committees, that price tag is the invisible wall Pete Benavides is running into.
And that's the friction. You have members like Gabe Vasquez and many of his Republican colleagues from high military population states who see this as an absolute debt of honor. Then you have the budget hawks who worry about the precedent of expanding concurrent receipt. They already expanded it back in 2004 for veterans with 20 years of service and a 50% disability rating or higher. The Starr Act would essentially finish the job for the remaining 50,000 or so combat-injured veterans.
The transcript shows that Benavides isn't just a name on a bill for Vasquez. He's someone who drives other veterans to the Raymond G. Murphy VA Medical Center in Albuquerque. He helps them fill out their own VA paperwork. He's navigating the very system he's trying to reform. It's a very personal brand of lobbying.
It also highlights how much Congress relies on these individual bridge figures. Most veterans won't ever call their representative. They'll just see their retirement check docked and assume that's the way it has to be. People like Pete Benavides are the ones who tell them, no, there's a specific line in the U.S. Code that does this, and we can change it.
There's a generational component here, too. Pete's son is currently serving in the New Mexico National Guard. When Vasquez mentions that in his tribute, he's signaling that this isn't just about the past. It's about the promise being made to the people currently in uniform. If the combat injury trap stays in place, it affects the recruitment and retention of the next generation.
I think it's easy to dismiss these floor tributes as just nice things members say for their constituents. But look at the timing. This was entered on a Friday, right before a series of committee markups on Veterans Affairs next month. Vasquez is placing a marker. He's making sure that when the Major Richard Starr Act comes up for debate again, the story of an IED survivor from Belen is already in the official record, making the abstract budget numbers a lot harder to hide behind.
It's the classic Hill strategy. Use a local hero to leverage a national policy change. Pete's story provides the emotional weight, while the Starr Act provides the technical solution. Whether the fiscal climate in 2026 allows for a $10 billion correction is the big question. But Vasquez is clearly not letting the issue go quiet.
And while that fight for long-term benefits continues, the rest of the House was churning through a mountain of smaller but no less revealing items before the weekend.
Which brings us to our Friday wrap-up. Let's move into the lightning round, the Friday slate. The Friday drop is always a unique window into the House. While the big headlines are dominated by the shutdown standoff, the hopper is still filling up with everything from high-stakes foreign policy to the technicalities of date farming in California. It's a massive list of 27 public bills and 6 resolutions introduced just yesterday.
It really highlights that all politics is local reality, even when the national government is partially stalled. You have members like Chris DeLuzio, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, introducing H.R. 8135. It would officially declare a national emergency regarding the cost of living. It's a broad bill hitting the committees on financial services, education and the workforce, and the judiciary.
The record says it would direct actions to be taken to address the cost of living emergency. That's a very assertive piece of legislation to drop on a Friday. And speaking of assertive, we have a pair of significant items from Rashida Tlaib, a Democrat from Michigan, regarding the situation in Lebanon.
Right. She's attacking this from 2 different angles. H-Con Res 83 is a war powers resolution. It directs the president to remove the United States Armed Forces from hostilities in Lebanon that have not been authorized by Congress.
Then, you have the rhetorical one, H-Res 1146. This one is a resolution standing with the people of Lebanon against the illegal invasion, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing perpetrated by the State of Israel. It was referred to the Foreign Affairs and Judiciary Committees.
It's a stark contrast to another resolution introduced yesterday, Friday, by Gus Bilirakis, a Republican from Florida. H-Res 1143 recognizes the 205th anniversary of the War of Greek Independence. It's a bipartisan one, too, with Chris Pappas, a Democrat from New Hampshire, joining him. It shows how the floor handles 2 very different Mediterranean priorities in the same afternoon.
There's also an interesting bit of institutional housekeeping from Bill Huizenga, a Republican from Michigan. He introduced H.R. 8139 to establish a new charter for the Congressional Office for International Leadership. Most people don't realize this, but that office runs the Open World Program, which brings emerging leaders from post-Soviet states and other countries to the U.S. to see democracy in action.
The fact that they're looking to re-charter it now suggests they want to put it on a more permanent or updated footing, especially given the current geopolitical climate. But let's shift gears to the economy. There's a 3-bill push on the Defense Production Act, or DPA. Sean Casten, a Democrat from Illinois, dropped H.R. 8133 to address workforce and skilled labor needs for the national defense.
Then you have H.R. 8136 from Cleo Fields, a Democrat from Louisiana, which asks the GAO to study the efficacy of procurement for long lead items. And Josh Gottheimer, a Democrat from New Jersey, added H.R. 8138 for special hiring authority under the DPA. It's rare to see three different members targeting the same 1950s-era law in one day. It tells you there's a real concern about the industrial base being able to keep up.
And while they're looking at defense manufacturing, Mike Lawler, a Republican from New York, is looking at your credit score. H.R. 8141 would amend the Fair Credit Reporting Act. It specifically targets resellers, the middleman companies that buy data from the big bureaus and package it for others. He wants to require them to follow reasonable procedures to assure maximum possible accuracy.
If you've ever tried to fix a mistake on a credit report, only to have it pop back up because a reseller had the old data, you know exactly why that bill exists. Moving to the Agriculture Committee's pile, which was surprisingly high for a Friday, Seth Moulton, a Democrat from Massachusetts, introduced H.R. 841. This is a fascinating one. It seeks to reaffirm the Commodity Futures Trading Commission's authority to enforce prohibited activity on prediction markets.
Prediction markets have become huge lately, where people bet on election outcomes or economic data. The CFTC has been trying to figure out if they're gambling or legitimate hedging tools. Moulton is clearly leaning toward giving the regulators more teeth.
Then there's the more traditional ag sector stuff. Joe Neguse, a Democrat from Colorado, is looking at the mental health of farmers. H.R. 8149 would require a study on the accessibility of addiction and mental health care for farmers and ranchers who have been hit by drought, market instability, and consumer misinformation. It's a recognition of the specific pressures on rural communities right now.
And don't overlook H.R. 8152 by Raul Ruiz, a Democrat from California. It's a bill regarding the treatment of dates for processing under marketing orders. It sounds like a small thing, but if you're a date grower in the Coachella Valley, how the USDA classifies processing dates versus fresh dates determines your entire bottom line for the year.
It's those pocketbook details that keep the Congressional Record running. On the health side, Terry Sewell, a Democrat from Alabama, introduced H.R. 8153 with a huge list of co-sponsors. It's about maternal vaccination awareness and equity. It's aiming to close the gap in who gets access to preventative care during pregnancy.
We also saw Norma Torres, a Democrat from California, introduce H.R. 8156 to set up a national, toll-free helpline for parents and youths to prevent child abuse. And Doris Matsui, a Democrat from California, is targeting drug costs with H.R. 8143. That bill would require Medicare Part D plans to include certain generic and biosimilar drugs on their formularies.
That's a direct shot at rebate walls, where big pharmaceutical companies negotiate to keep cheaper generics off the list of covered drugs. Matsui is trying to force those generics into the hands of seniors.
We should also mention the more symbolic side of Friday. Andy Ogles, a Republican from Tennessee, introduced H.R. 8150. It's a very specific bill that would require the flag to be flown at half-staff on the first Friday and Saturday after the full moon that occurs on or after the spring equinox. For those who don't have a liturgical calendar handy, that is the formula for Good Friday and Holy Saturday.
It's a unique way to codify a period of mourning in federal law. There were also resolutions for Women's History Month from Mike Thompson, a Democrat from California, and a concurrent resolution supporting International Transgender Day of Visibility from Sarah Jacobs, a Democrat from California.
And before we get to our final highlight, look at H.R. 8132 from Cliff Bentz, a Republican from Oregon. He's trying to adjust the compensation for the administrator of the Bonneville Power Administration. It's a massive federal agency that handles power in the Pacific Northwest, and apparently they're having trouble keeping leadership pay competitive with the private utility market.
It's a classic example of the administrative state trying to keep up with the private sector. But I want to close the round with a speech from Lloyd Smucker, a Republican from Pennsylvania. He rose to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Lancaster-Lebanon Habitat for Humanity.
He gave some really concrete numbers on their impact. Since 1986, they've made homeownership a reality for over 300 families. He mentioned the Emerald Valley development in Lancaster City, which has 70 homes, and their new Linden Street project in Columbia.
What stood out in the transcript was Smucker's mention of the Wheatland Build, an 8-home project that relies on federal home program funds. In the middle of a national housing crisis, Smucker is pointing out that these local nonprofits can't do it on volunteer labor and sweat equity alone. They need those federal block grants to bridge the gap.
It's a subtle but important nod to the fact that even for a member who often advocates for fiscal restraint, these specific federal programs are the lifeblood of housing development in his district. It's a perfect bridge from the high-level policy of the lightning round back to how these decisions actually look on the ground.
Exactly. From date farming to defense production, Friday in the House is about placing markers for the weeks to come. And while these bills wait for their committee hearings, there's one project on the National Mall that won't have to wait much longer for its new resident.
Let's talk about that.
When looking through the record from yesterday, Friday, there's a palpable sense that the House is setting the stage for a very intense month of April.
Right. The language in the floor speeches shows a pivot from standard policy debates toward much more formal oversight. It seems the legislative priorities are being reshuffled in real time, moving away from the usual procedural rhythm as the spring session heats up.
And that shift is underscored by a significant last-minute addition to the hopper before the members departed for the weekend break. As the House heads home, keep an eye on H.R. 8154. It's a new bill calling for a special prosecutor to investigate the Department of Homeland Security's actions over the last 14 months.
That is quite the parting shot. It means that even as they move toward the complex process of funding the department, the focus on investigation is really just getting started. This signals a dual-track strategy that will likely dominate the conversation the next time the House is in session.
That's Floor Notes Extended for today.
Appreciate you tuning in. We'll be right here waiting for the next round of transcripts to drop.